everybody. And in this bonus episode today, I'm going to read you an article that Nikola Tesla wrote for a magazine. In it, he describes his unique process of developing wireless free energy technology in great detail. And I'm reading this because I want to draw attention to how he speaks about technology. Nikola Tesla speaks very differently about technology than we do today. He includes the planets and consciousness in the discussion as though they are directly linked to technology. This is something that we just don't see today. Today we see a scientific community that removes or distorts consciousness and spirit and ether. They remove it from the equation entirely, at least publicly. They do this even though they use Tesla's work as a basis for their own. Even Tesla's name and image is now attached to a school of technological and societal advancement that does not actually represent or actually honor Tesla's vision and methods. And as I was finding this article to read to you guys, it was really strange. Several of the reproductions of the articles actually left out information, notably the introduction, talking about other worlds, and just started right in when Nikola Tesla was discussing the specifics of the technology. They actually edited out the parts about interplanetary communication and the whole introduction about the excitement of discovering other worlds and communicating with them. So this is just another example of how even this censorship is occurring, even with the most innocent of articles, the most innocent of discussions about the planets and consciousness and interplanetary communication. Since this article is over 100 years old, the language will be a bit different than ours today, but let's try to listen to how he speaks about the technologies he is creating and his clear inclusion of the planets, particularly Mars, and consciousness in general. How does this come into his development of free energy and consciousness-based technology? Editor's note. Nikola Tesla has accomplished some marvelous results in electrical discoveries. Now with the dawn of the new century, he announces an achievement which will amaze the entire universe, and which eclipses the wildest dreams of the most visionary scientist. He has received communication. He asserts from out of the great void of space a call from the inhabitants of Mars or Venus or some other sister planet. And furthermore, noted scientists like Sir Norman Lockyer are disposed to agree with Mr. Tesla and his startling deductions. Mr. Tesla has not only discovered many important principles, but most of his inventions are in practical use, notably in the harnessing of the titanic forces of Niagara Falls and the discovery of a new light by means of a vacuum tube. He has, he declares, solved the problem of telegraphing without wires or artificial conductors of any sort, using the earth as his medium. By means of this principle, he expects to be able to send messages under the ocean and to any distance on the Earth's surface. Interplanetary communication has interested him for years, and he sees no reason why we should not soon be within talking distance of Mars or of all other worlds in the solar system that may be tenanted by intelligent beings. At the request of Collier's Weekly, Mr. Tesla presents herewith a frank statement of what he expects to accomplishment and how he hopes to establish communication with the planets. The idea of communicating with the inhabitants of other worlds is an old one, but for ages it has been regarded merely as a poet's dream and forever unrealizable. And yet, with the invention of the perfection of the telescope and the ever-widening knowledge of the heavens, it holds upon our imaginations has been increased, and the scientific achievements during the latter part of the 19th century, together with the development of the tendency towards the nature ideal of Goethe, have intensified it to such a degree that it seems as if it were destined to become the dominating idea of the century that has just begun. The desire to know something of our neighbors in the immense depths of space does not spring from idle curiosity, nor from thirst for knowledge, but from a deeper cause, and it is a feeling firmly rooted in the heart of every human being capable of knowing all. Whence, then, does it come? Who knows? Who can assign limits to the subtlety of nature's influences? Perhaps, if we could clearly perceive all the intricate mechanism of the glorious spectacle that is continually unfolding before us, and could also trace this desire to its distant origin, we might find it in the sorrowful vibrations of the earth, which began when it parted from its celestial parent. But in this age of reason, it is not astonishing to find persons who scoff at the very thought of effecting communication with the planet. First of all, the argument is made that there is only a small probability of other planets being inhabited at all. This argument has never appealed to me. In the solar system, there seems to be only 2 planets, Venus and Mars, capable of sustaining life such as ours. But this does not mean that there might not be on all of them some other forms of life. Chemical processes may be maintained without the aid of oxygen, and it is still a question whether chemical processes are absolutely necessary for the sustenance of organized beings. My idea is that the development of life must lead to forms of existence that will be possible without nourishment, and which will not be shackled by consequent limitations. Why should a living being not be able to obtain all the energy it needs for the performance of its life functions from the environment, instead of through consumption of food, and transforming by a complicated process the energy of chemical combinations into life-sustaining energy? If there were such beings on one of the planets, we should know next to nothing about them. Nor is it necessary to go so far in our assumptions, for we can readily conceive that in the same degree as the atmosphere diminishes in density, moisture disappears and the planet freezes up. Organic life may also undergo corresponding modifications, leading finally to forms which, according to our present ideas of life, are impossible. I will readily admit, of course, that if there should be a sudden catastrophe of any kind, all life processes may be arrested. But if the change, no matter how great, should be gradual and occupied ages, so that the ultimate results would be intelligently foreseen, I cannot help but think that reasoning beings would still find means of existence. They would adapt themselves to their constantly changing environment. So I think it quite possible that in a frozen planet such as our moon is supposed to be, intelligent beings may still dwell in its interior, if not on its surface. signaling at 100 million miles. Then it is contended that it is beyond human power and ingenuity to convey signals to the almost inconceivable distances of 50 million or 100 million miles. This might have been a valid argument formerly. It is not so now. Most of those who are enthusiastic upon the subject of interplanetary communication have reposed their faith in the light ray as the best possible medium of such communication. True, waves of light, owing to their immense rapidity of succession, can penetrate space more readily than the waves of less rapid, but a more simple consideration will show that by their means an exchange of signals between this Earth and its companions in the solar system is, at least now, impossible. By way of illustration, let us suppose that a square mile of the Earth's surface, the smallest area that might possibly be within reach of the best telescopic vision of other worlds, were covered with incandescent lamps, packed closely together so as to form, when illuminated, a continuous sheet of light. It would require not less than 100 million horsepower to light this area of lamps, and this is many times the amount of motive power now in the service of man throughout the world. But what the novel means, proposed by myself, I can readily demonstrate that, with an expenditure not exceeding 2,000 horsepower, signals can be transmitted to a planet such as Mars with as much exactness and certitude as we now send messages by wire from New York to Philadelphia. These means are the result of long, continued experiment and gradual improvement. Some 10 years ago, I recognized the fact that to convey electrical currents to a distance, it was not at all necessary to employ a return wire, but that any amount of energy might be transmitted by using a single wire. I illustrated this principle by numerous experiments which, at the time, excited considerable attention among scientific men. This being practically demonstrated, my next step was to use the Earth itself as the medium for conducting the currents, thus dispensing with wires and all other artificial conductors. So I was led to the development of a system of energy transmission and of telegraphy without the use of wires, which I described in 1893. The difficulties I encountered at first in the transmissions of currents through the Earth were very great. At that time I had only ordinary apparatus, which I found to be ineffective, and I concentrated my attention immediately upon perfecting machines for this special purpose. This work consumed a number of years, but I finally vanquished all difficulties and succeeded in producing a machine which, to explain its operation in plain language, resembled a pump in its action, drawing electricity from the Earth and driving it back into the same at an enormous rate, thus creating ripples or disturbances which, spreading through the Earth as through a wire, could be detected at great distances by carefully attuned receiving circuits. In this manner, I was able to transmit to a distance not only feeble effects for purposes of signaling, but considerable amounts of energy. And later discoveries I made convinced me that I shall ultimately succeed in conveying power without wires for industrial purposes, with high economy, and to any distance, however great. Experiments in Colorado. To develop these inventions further, I went to Colorado, and where I continued my investigations along these and other lines, one of which in particular I now consider of even greater importance than the transmission of power without wires. I constructed a laboratory in the neighborhood of Pikes Peak. The conditions in the pure air of the Colorado mountains proved extremely favorable for my experiments, and the results were most gratifying to me. I found that I could not only accomplish more work, physically and mentally, than I could in New York, but that electrical effects and changes were more readily and distinctly perceived. A few years ago, it was virtually impossible to produce electrical sparks 20 or 30 foot long, but I produced some more than 100 feet in length, and this was without difficulty. The rates of electrical movement involved in strong induction apparatus had measured but a few hundred horsepower, and I produced electrical movements of rates of 100 and 10,000 horsepower. Prior to this, only insignificant electrical pressures were obtained, while I have reached 50 million volts. The accompanying illustrations, with their descriptive titles taken from an article I wrote from the, quote, Century magazine, The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, unquote, may serve to convey an idea of the results I obtained in the directions indicated. Many persons in my own profession have wondered at them and have asked what I am trying to do. But the time is not far away now when the practical results of my labors will be placed before the world and their influence felt everywhere. One of the immediate consequences will be the transmission of messages without wires over sea or land to an immense distance. I've already demonstrated by crucial tests the practicability of signaling by my system from one to any other point on the globe, no matter how remote, and I shall soon convert the disbelievers. I have every reason for congratulating myself that I have throughout these experiments, many of which were exceedingly delicate and hazardous. Neither myself nor any of my assistants received any injury. When working with these powerful electrical oscillations, the most extraordinary phenomena takes place at times. Owing to some interference of the oscillations, veritable balls of fire are apt to leap to the great distance, and if anyone were within or near their paths, he would be instantly destroyed. A machine such as I have used could easily kill, in an instant, 300,000 persons. I observed that the strain upon my assistants was telling, and some of them could not endure the extreme tension of the nerves. But these perils are now entirely overcome, and the operation of such apparatus, however powerful, involves no risk whatsoever. As I was improving my machines for the production of intense electrical actions, I was also perfecting the means for observing feeble effects. One of the most interesting results, and also one of great practical importance, was the development of certain contrivances for indicating at a distance of many hundred miles an approaching storm, its direction, speed, and distance traveled. These appliances are likely to be valuable in the future meteorological observations and surveying, and will lend themselves particularly to many naval uses. It was in carrying on this work that for the first time I discovered those mysterious effects which have elicited some unusual interest. I had perfected the apparatus referred to so far that from my laboratory in the Colorado mountains I could feel the pulse of the globe, as it were, noting every electrical change that occurred within a radius of 1,100 miles. Terrified by success, I can never forget the first sensations I experienced when it dawned upon me that I had observed something possibly of an incalculable consequences to mankind. I felt as though I were present at a birth of a new knowledge or the revelation of a great truth. Even now, at times, I can vividly recall the incident and see my apparatus as though it were actually before me. My first observations positively terrified me, as there was present in them something mysterious, not to say supernatural, and I was alone in my laboratory at night. But at the time, the idea of these disturbances being intelligently controlled signals did not yet present itself to me. The changes I noted were taking place periodically, and with such clear suggestion of number and order that they were not traceable to any cause then known to me. I was familiar, of course, with such electrical disturbances that are produced by the sun, aurora borealis, and earth currents, and I was as sure I could be of any fact that these variations were due to none of these causes. The nature of my experience precluded the possibility of the changes being produced by atmospheric disturbances, as has been rashly asserted by some. It was some time afterwards when the thought flashed upon my mind that the disturbances I had observed might be due to an intelligent control. Although I could not decipher their meaning, it was impossible for me to think of them as having been entirely accidental. The feeling is constantly growing on me that I had been the first to hear the greetings of one planet to another. A purpose was behind these electrical signals, and it was this conviction that I announced to the Red Cross Society when it asked me to indicate one of the great possible achievements of the next 100 years, that it would probably be the confirmation and interpretation of this planetary challenge to us. Since my return to New York, more urgent work has consumed all my attention. But I have never ceased to think of those experiences and of the observances made in Colorado. I am constantly endeavoring to improve and perfect my apparatus, and just as soon as practicable, I shall again take up the thread of my investigations at the point where I have been forced to lay it down for a time. Communicating with the Martians. At the present stage of progress, there would be no insurmountable obstacles in constructing a machine capable of conveying a message to Mars, nor would there be any great difficulty in recording signals transmitted to us by the inhabitants of that planet, if they be skilled electricians. Communication once established, even in the simplest way, as by mere interchange of numbers, the progress toward more intelligible communication would be rapid. Absolute certitude as to the receipt and exchange of messages would be reached as soon as we could respond with the number 4, say, in reply to the signal 1, 2, 3. The Martians, or the inhabitants of whatever planet has signaled to us, would understand at once that we had caught their message across the gulf of space and sent back a response. To convey a knowledge of form by such means is, while very difficult, not impossible, and I have already found a way of doing it. What a tremendous stir this would make in the world! How soon will it come? For that it will some time be accomplished must be clear to every thoughtful being. Something, at least, science has gained. But I hope that it will also be demonstrated soon that in my experiments in the West, I was not merely beholding a vision, but I had caught sight of a great and profound truth. I decided to read you this over 100-year-old article by Nikola Tesla because I think that it illustrates a deep part of science and a deep part of his work that many people forget to include. And this is the reality that Nikola Tesla considered the planets and planetary communication or interplanetary communication to go hand in hand with his free energy experiments. And when he wrote about them, he considered that when electrical signals were sent, that they first went through the Earth and then they went into other planets. And there was this circuitry of planets that was part of sort of this interplanetary communication that could be done through electricity or perhaps even consciousness as like a higher form of that. And Nikola Tesla is hinting that to us. He's not just talking about science here. He is talking about science hand in hand with spirit. He's talking about the development of his free energy machines and very technical apparatus that would impress any scientific materialist, and yet he's also speaking in the same breath with the same fluency that a psychic would or that a medium would about the planets being circuitry for consciousness, planets communicating with humans, beings on planets. And so Nikola Tesla, even over 100 years ago, was working in a science that was so far ahead of his time that we have not even yet caught up with it. Well, some people perhaps have taken this work and have turned it into something different, which we will get into in this series very deeply. But it's important to consider this blueprint of talking about science and spirit in the same breath, in the same way. The last thing that is very interesting about this article is that Nikola Tesla brings up Mars. He could have brought up Venus. He mentions Venus here as being the other sister planet, or the other planet that is likely to be inhabited and significant to Earth. But for some reason, he really focuses on Mars. And this is very interesting because we have Elon Musk in our modern times who has taken it upon himself to use Tesla as a brand, to brand himself and directly associate himself with Nikola Tesla, and also to Mars. And in this series, we are going to be going deeper into the planets and the specific order in which planets have to be activated or interacted with in order to leave this sphere or open certain planetary gates. So, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It was my absolute pleasure to read this to you, and I will see you in my next video. Don't forget to comment, share, like, and subscribe.